Well, good morning, everybody. I'm Jason Cusick. I'm the lead pastor here at the church. And if you're new with us, maybe you're visiting with us for the first time, I want to say a special welcome to you. This is actually a great Sunday to be here because we're getting ready to go on a big adventure here on Sunday mornings. In a couple of weeks, we are starting a series to go through the entire Bible together in 18 months. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at the main stories of the Bible that create this really grand narrative together. We're calling it the Story Project. And it's going to be a great opportunity to look at the whole Bible. Now, why are we doing this? We're doing this because the Bible is actually the main text of Christianity for 2,000 years. And many of us might be familiar with some of the parts, but not the whole story. And the Bible is actually not just the story of God interacting with people thousands of years ago. As we get into the grand narrative of the Bible, we realize that God's story is actually our story. It's the story of how God interacts with us. So we're going to look at this idea of the whole story. And what we're going to do this week and next week is get ready for this adventure we're going to take together. Now, one of the problems that we have when we read the Bible is we're kind of like, where do I fit into this? And it's sometimes hard to locate ourselves in it if we don't know the whole story. Let me give you an example. I want to tell you the story about somebody named Alice. You might have heard this story before. Alice grew up going to church, but early on in her life, her parents had a falling out with church. She stopped going. She spent her life going through a lot of ups and downs, in and out of relationships, in and out of jobs and careers, looking for her identity and her purpose in life. She ended up getting married, had 2 kids, but one of them passed away from suicide. She also ended up finding herself being an alcoholic. And then she ended up getting a very bad cancer diagnosis. One day she showed up at a church and someone gave her a Bible. Let me stop right there and just tell you, I've told you the whole story. I've given you the basic parts of the story, but you're probably already feeling like there's more to this story. There's parts of it that you're not saying that would somehow make it come alive and might relate to me personally. Same thing is true in the Bible. A lot of us know some of the basic stories and touch points of the grand story of the Bible, but if we really knew all of it, or a lot more of it, it would become more engaging, more intriguing, and even more personal. Let me go back to the story of Alice and fill in some gaps for you. Alice was my aunt, my dad's sister. When she was young, she was in church. Her dad, my grandfather, was a church leader, and there was a conflict, and they fell out of church and never went back. As Alice grew up and she went through different stages in life, I got to know her more, and I asked her, when I became a follower of Jesus, I started asking her about her spiritual life, and she said, I'm more of a spiritual than a religious person. So she had spiritual beliefs, but it never really resulted in a personal relationship with God that gave her identity and purpose until she started getting sober. She went to 12-step meetings and then started thinking about her relationship with God. And when she got her cancer diagnosis, she said, you know what? I think I'm going to give church a try. And she went back to church. You know what church she went to? This one. I didn't even invite her. She showed up one Sunday, and I saw her sitting right around this area over here. And I said, what brings you to church? She said, I just want more of God in my life. I decided I needed to attend a church. I don't even know if I belong here. Now, here's where the story takes an interesting turn. A couple weeks later, an older woman here at the church named Hazel was at an estate sale, and she comes to church and she says, do you have a relative named Alice? I said, yeah, I do. She said, I found this, And it was a Bible, and on the front of it said, Alice Cusick. She said, here, I want to give this to you. The next week, when Alice showed up, I walked up to her, I said, is this yours? She looked at it, she started to tear up. She said, this is my Bible from when I was a little girl. I said, I think you do belong here, and I don't think God's done with your story. Alice ended up saying yes to Jesus in her life. She experienced God's forgiveness and love. She grew in her faith, and when she passed away with the confidence that God had made her. She was God's daughter, and God had been holding her through all the difficulties in life. Alice's story was God's story and Alice's story, and it became Hazel's story, and it became my story. And because you're here at church where Alice showed up, kind of your story now too. The same thing happens when we read the Bible. When we understand the grand story of the Bible, we end up saying it's not just a story about other people, it's a story about me. And then it begins changing us. And that's the main idea I want to share with you today. We can be transformed by understanding that we are part of God's story. I want to share with you a couple of ways that we can see that in the Bible, and then we're going to finish our service celebrating communion together and having one more song together. Here's where we're going to look at in the Bible to talk about this a little bit today. It's in Luke chapter 24. This is the third book in the New Testament, and it's written by Luke. Luke was a first century physician, actually, and he had heard a lot of the stories going around about Jesus. He said, I'm going to start interviewing people, and I'm going to write this down, and he did, and we have it 2,000 years later today. And the section we're going to read here, Luke 24:13-34, it's an unusual story because it takes place after Jesus died and rose again, but it's the story of two disciples that didn't have the whole story. They were there when Jesus died, and they heard that Jesus had rose again, but there was also a rumor going around that his body had been stolen, and they're really confused and disoriented, and then Jesus shows up. Here's what it says. Two of Jesus' followers were walking to the village of Emmaus, 7 miles from Jerusalem. As they walked along, they were talking about everything that had happened. As they talked and discussed these things, Jesus himself suddenly came and began walking with them, but God kept them from recognizing him. Now, what does that mean? Well, we're not totally sure, but Jesus plays along. And here's what it says. Jesus asked them, what are you discussing so intently as you walk along? I love this. Jesus is in stealth mode, and he's kind of like, you guys are really seriously talking about some stuff. What's going on? He's trying to draw them out, kind of like he does with us. It's not that he doesn't know what we're thinking or feeling, but Jesus is like, what are you thinking and feeling? Right? They stop short, sadness written across their faces, and then one of them, Cleopas, replied, you must be the only person in Jerusalem who hasn't heard about all the things that have happened here in the last few days. Jesus' response is great. He's like, what things? Now, this bothers them because Jesus is playing dumb here, and they're like, how could you not know what's going on? He says, what things? And they say, the things that happened to Jesus. The man from Nazareth, they said, he was a prophet who did powerful miracles. He was as mighty a teacher in the eyes of God and all the people. But our leading priests and other religious leaders handed him over to be condemned to death, and they crucified him. And we had hoped that he was the Messiah who had come to rescue Israel. And all this happened 3 days ago. He says, then some women from our group of his followers were at his tomb early in the morning, and they came back with an amazing report. They said his body was missing, and they had seen angels who told them that Jesus was alive. And some of our men ran out to see, and sure enough, his body was gone, just as the women had said. So they're all like, we have no idea what's going on. We're really confused. Jesus finally has enough. He's like, these guys do not have the whole story. Like, you guys aren't getting it. And here's how Jesus responds. He says to them, you foolish people. You don't want Jesus saying, you guys are foolish. What are you talking about? He says, you foolish people, you find it so hard to believe all that the prophets wrote in the scriptures? Wasn't it clearly predicted that the Messiah would have to suffer all these things before entering his glory? Then Jesus took them through the writings of Moses and all the prophets, explaining from all the scriptures the things concerning himself. Now, what does this unique story have to say about us, about how we can be transformed by understanding that we are part of God's story? Well, the first thing is, it's interesting, these guys, they're stuck in the Jesus died part of the story. They're kind of confused about what they've got one segment and they're kind of locked in. Did you catch that line where they said, we had hoped he was the Messiah who had come to rescue? They weren't seeing his death as part of the rescuing of Israel. Like the minute he died, their hope was gone. And that happens with us. Sometimes what happens is we get locked into one part of the story of our life that's happening. And we find our identity and our purpose in life in that one part. And that's something we have to be careful of. Happened with me just this last weekend. We were, my family and I, we were in Kansas. My son Ethan graduated with his master's degree from KU. Here's a picture of us together. And yay! So we're like celebrating and we're like, this is amazing. And he's taking pictures and I'm saying like, who am I now? Like my wife and I, a big part of our identity and purpose in life was raising our kids. It's like, who am I now? Like that part of our life is shifting. Some of you are in that phase where a big part of your life is investing in your kids. And then that part's going to end. Some of you are students. You're in that phase of life where a big part of your life is your identity and your purpose in life is wrapped around your parents and how they're parenting you and what their wishes for you are. And that's going to change. What ends up happening is we often shape our identity and our purpose in life around things that change. Like, here's my job, and then your job changes. Or you become unemployed, and then you're like, I am an unemployed person, and then that's your identity. I have no purpose in life because I don't have a job. Or a relationship. I am now in a relationship, and then you get out of the relationship, you're like, who am I now? Or your health. I am healthy, and then you become unhealthy, and you're like, now I am an unhealthy person. Sometimes our identity and purpose in life is shaped around something that happened in the past. When I think about things like traumatic things that happened in our past, I think about wet cement. It's like the cement is wet and somebody does something to you or says something to you, and then the cement hardens. And you're like, that's me. Some of us are stuck in an event in our past. There is a better way. If we can be transformed by understanding that we're part of God's story, and here's one way we can do it. Find your identity and mission through God's story. When we get into God's story, we realize my identity and purpose is much bigger than the individual events of my life. I'll give an example of what that'll look like as we go through the whole Bible. So in 2 weeks, we're starting a short series where we're going to look at 4 significant stories in the book of Genesis. We're calling it In the Beginning. And these 4 stories in the book of Genesis, they're not really as much stories about individual people having faith in God or not having faith in God. They're really like these big epic narratives about humanity. The first stories of the Bible are really about who we are. We are people of dignity and worth because we're made by God. We are people who are vulnerable and flawed because we tend to give in to temptation rather than resist. And we're also the kind of people that rather than focusing on making God famous, we're always out looking to make a name for ourselves. And that's what these big narratives are going to be talking about. So what we're going to be doing in a couple of weeks is saying, how could we build our identity and our purpose in life, not on ourselves and not on the individual stories of our lives, but on God's story? So here's an action step for us to prepare for that. Prayerfully prepare to be transformed. Get excited about, all right, we're going to go into the grand story of the Bible in a new way. I want to get ready. What would that look like? Now, some of you are like, you think about going through the Bible, you're like, ooh, I'm kind of overwhelmed by that. Okay, give that to God too. And here's something I want to challenge you with. If you don't have a physical Bible, get a physical Bible. We'll talk a little bit more about it, why. If you need a starter Bible, we have some today that you can get on the way out. You can also go online and get a Bible. I picked this one up, and it's connected to what's called a Filament app. So I can scan my phone on a page, and it'll pull up Bible notes that have been really, really helpful for me. And if you're looking for a Bible online, this is the translation that we use. It's called the New Living Translation, the NLT. And that'll help you follow along. But having a physical Bible is going to help you through this series because we're going to go through, you'll be able to track where you're at, and you'll hear more about that next week. So that's one way that we can be transformed is by finding our identity not in the specific events and successes and tragedies of our life, but within the grand narrative of God's story. Now, there's something else I want to show you. Let's go back to that story. They're locked in, right? These two disciples have heard Jesus died. Somebody said he rose again. All we know, his body is not there. We don't know where Jesus is. And they're confused. So what does Jesus do to help them out of their confusion and disorientation and question about who they are and what they're there to do? Did you catch that? Here's what it says. Then Jesus took them through the writings of Moses and all the prophets, explaining from all the scriptures the things concerning himself. Now, he may not have actually taken them, well, he didn't take them through a physical Bible. They didn't have Bibles back then. They were understanding the teachings of Jesus happened in the synagogues. In fact, most of the stories they knew were passed on orally to them. So Jesus is probably recalling, hey, remember you were taught this, remember you were taught that. And what I find interesting is Luke doesn't tell us which stories Jesus told. Where did he point out? I'm like, tell me where you can find yourself. Jesus said, isn't it clear? And I'm like, where? Help me find that. So we don't know what it is. So we're left to kind of explore some of that ourselves. But what he's trying to do is help them see the big picture. And that's the other way we can be transformed. And that is see the big picture of God's story. When we see the big picture, then we can say, oh, I see kind of where I fit into this, or I see how I'm similar or different to other people that have interacted with God. Now, in this series we're going to start in a couple of weeks, we're going to go through 14 eras of stories. Here's what they're going to be. They're kind of broken down in these different ways. And we're going to go through all of these, and we're going to find kind of some key stories. Now, the cool thing is, if you're attending church every week, you're going to get 60 stories from the Bible. If you're in your life group, you're going to get 30 more. So it's almost 100 stories that are going to create this grand narrative. And at the end, you're going to be at a place where you're like, not only do I see myself in this and I understand a little bit more, but I can share it with others, because that's what a great story is. I think some of you might actually leave today and tell people this story about Alice. You know, like, oh, this Bible showed up and this person had this and then the person was there and it timed up. You know, some of you are going to tell that story. That's what we're supposed to be doing with Bible stories. In fact, look at this really great song lyric that's recorded in the Bible about that idea. "O my people, listen to my instructions. Open your ears to what I'm saying, for I will speak to you in a parable. I will teach you hidden lessons from our past, stories we have heard and known, stories our ancestors handed down to us." And then look at this. "We will not hide these truths from our children. We will tell the next generation about the glorious deeds of the Lord, about his power and his mighty works." Great stories are meant to be told and retold, and they're meant to transform us and help us to locate who we are in a world that's constantly changing. Now, how are we going to walk through 60 to 90 stories together? How will we do that? Here's an action step for you. Come back next week and hear how. That's how we're going to do it. Okay, so here's what we talked about today. We can be transformed by understanding that we are part of God's story. Find your identity and mission through God's story, not yours. Yours is part of the story, but don't get hung up on all the changes. It's normal and natural to have the ups and downs. That's normal and natural. But what would it be like to step back and see this bigger story and say, I'm part of that, and see the big picture of God's story, the whole thing? That's what we're going to be looking at. Now, we're going to shift here, and we're going to close our service by celebrating communion and having a song together. So I'm going to ask our singers and musicians to come out here. And as they do, I want to just tell you how the story ends, this story of the disciples on the road with Jesus. Here's what it says. By this time, after Jesus had shared all the things about himself, he said, by this time, they were nearing Emmaus, right? That was the place they were headed toward at the end of their journey. Jesus acted as if he was going on, but they begged him, stay the night with us since it's getting late. So he went home with them. As they sat down to eat, he took the bread and blessed it, and then he broke it and gave it to them. Suddenly, their eyes were opened, and they recognized him. I love this because the last time the disciples sat down and had a meal with Jesus where he prayed and broke bread and passed it out was the Last Supper. And it was almost like when he did that, the light bulb went on. They were like, wait, this is Jesus. Jesus has been in our lives, and I didn't know it. And I think that is also something that spiritually and powerfully happens when we celebrate communion. We do a symbolic meal where we take a piece of bread and we distribute it amongst ourselves. And then it's like we say, Jesus, here am I, valued and vulnerable. Help me to recognize you in my life so that I can live for you. So that's what we're going to do today. I'm going to pray, and then I'll give you some instructions about how we'll celebrate communion together. Let's pray. God, thank you for the opportunity to be together today, and thank you that we are part of your big story. Help us to be more aware of that. And as we eat together this small symbolic meal, help us to see you in a different way in those stories of our life that we might be confused about. We thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.